Eric Fromm on happiness from his work, Man for Himself, an Inquiry into the Psychology of Ethics. All right, let's just get to it. What he's doing here is distinguishing between what he calls satisfaction from happiness. And satisfaction for him is the kind of fulfilling of a bodily need, right? It's kind of rooted in our organism. Whereas happiness, well, that for him is life well lived. And they're similar. Satisfaction and happiness are similar, but with major differences. So I'm just going to launch into it. Fromm asserts hunger, thirst, and the need for sexual satisfaction, sleep, and bodily exercise are rooted in the chemism of the organism. The objective physiological necessity to satisfy these demands is perceived subjectively as desire. And if they remain unsatisfied for any length of time, painful tension is felt. If this tension is released, the relief is felt as pleasure, or as I propose to call it, satisfaction. This term, from satisfacere, to make sufficient, seems to be most appropriate for this kind of pleasure. It's the very nature of all such physiologically conditioned needs that their satisfaction ends the tension due to the physiological changes brought about in the organism. And so, a couple of examples of satisfaction would be drinking when you're really thirsty, eating when you're really hungry, or I mean, like perhaps even a better example is like if you have to pee really bad, and that kind of tension builds up in your bladder, and it's really uncomfortable, and then you pee, and you have a kind of pleasure, but that's you would call that satisfaction, right? Or like another example would be like scratching an itch is satisfaction, right? You have a kind of desire to get rid of the tension or the suffering, and when you do, it's a pleasure that he calls satisfaction. Fromm continues, he asserts, in all spheres of activity, the difference between scarcity and abundance, right? Not having enough and then having a lot. And therefore, between satisfaction and happiness exists, even with regard to elementary functions like hunger and sex. And I think the point he's making here is you need a kind of excess to have freedom of choice. Freedom involves freedom of alternatives. And so if you only got one way, you don't really have freedom, right? If you only had one food, you wouldn't be able to develop a taste, a sense of taste. All right, Fromm continues. He says, to satisfy the physiological need of intense hunger is pleasurable because it relieves tension. Different in quality from satisfaction of hunger is the pleasure derived from the satisfaction of appetite. See, appetite's very interesting because it involves gratification delay. And gratification delay is essential if you're going to kind of cultivate the sensibilities involved in kind of happiness, taste, and joy. You know, you can't just rush at it, but you got to be patient, right? If it matters, it takes time and it takes energy. So Fromm continues. He says, appetite is the anticipation of enjoyable taste experience, and in distinction to hunger, does not produce tension. Taste in this sense is a product of cultural development and refinement, like musical or artistic taste, and can develop only in a situation of abundance, both in the cultural and the psychological meaning of the word. Hunger is a phenomenon of scarcity, right? So if you're hungry, anything's good. You know, I was hungry today, so I had crackers and peanut butter, and it was awesome. Uh, there wasn't really anything around. I had to eat, and if that would have gone far enough, and if I was really hungry, it's kind of hard to know where my limitations would be, right? So again, hunger is a phenomenon of scarcity. It's satisfaction and necessity. Appetite, on the other hand, is a phenomenon of abundance, right? The kind of freedom to choose among different things, right? This rich cornucopia. It's so appetite is a phenomenon of abundance. It's satisfaction, not a necessity, but an expression of freedom and productiveness, right? You're living well. That's what that means. It's life as it ought to be lived. And, he says this, and this is very interesting. The pleasure accompanying it, right? The pleasure accompanying, like a really good meal that you have a good appetite for, may be called joy. The pleasure accompanying appetite and any kind of delayed gratification where you're living as you ought to be living may be called joy. And that's why they say appetite is the best sauce. Fromm continues. He says, happiness and joy are not the satisfaction of a need springing from a physiological or a psychological lack. They are not the relief from tension, but the accompaniment of all productive activity and thought, feeling, and action. He continues, happiness is the indication that man has found the answer to the problem of human existence, the productive realization of his potentialities, and thus simultaneously being one with the world and preserving the integrity of his self. Happiness is the criterion of excellence in the art of living, a virtue in the meaning it has in humanistic ethics. The opposite of happiness, thus, is not grief or pain, but depression, which results from inner sterility and unproductiveness. Right? So that's very interesting. It's very interesting. I won't belabor to the point, but maybe a lot of our suffering and our depression and our kind of technological need in the pop culture for all means of psychological painkillers, all the way, whether it's alcohol or it's the serotonin reuptake inhibitors like, Zoloft or Paxil or Prozac or something like that. What if there's something to, I don't know, that, a lack of the argument that he's making regarding a lack of gratification delay and an inability to kind of, I don't know, enjoy the freedom and the abundance of existence. So again, here's the last thing he says. Fromm asserts, happiness is man's greatest achievement. It is the response of his total personality to a productive orientation toward himself and the outside world.